$50 million. Gone in a flash. That is the staggering, catastrophic plunge in New York City bank reserves in the fall of 1873, plunging the entire nation and really the world into sudden, terrifying chaos. Welcome to this explainer on the Panic of 1873. If you enjoy history, business, and finance documentaries like this, consider subscribing. It really helps the channel out. So let's dive right in. How does a booming, rapidly industrializing global economy just evaporate overnight? Well, it all started with trains. Between 1868 and 1873, an unbelievable 33,000 miles of new railroad track were laid across America. It was an era of absolutely wild speculation. Massive government land grants and financial subsidies fueled this explosive railroad boom, turning the industry into the largest employer outside of agriculture. But here is the massive catch. Huge amounts of cash from speculators were being poured into ambitious projects offering absolutely no immediate returns. We're talking zero. The economy was building the future, sure, but it was doing it entirely on borrowed time and borrowed money. Now, before the real crash even hit, a rapid succession of seemingly unrelated disasters began severely straining bank liquidity. Think of it like a series of body blows to the economy. First, you have the Black Friday gold panic of 1869, shaking investor confidence. Then millions of dollars in property quite literally went up in smoke during the Great Chicago Fire of 1871. In 1872, a bizarre outbreak of equine influenza paralyzed horse-drawn transport across major cities. And later that same year, the Great Boston Fire devastated yet another massive financial hub. The system's reserves were cracking under the pressure. But the first true domino to fall actually happened across the Atlantic. On May 9, 1873, a day known as Black Friday in Austria, the Vienna Stock Exchange completely crashed. This violently burst the European Founders' Years bubble, which was basically a false expansion built on post-war euphoria and massive war reparations paid by France to Germany. And when this bubble popped, it caused a massive contraction in the foreign capital that American railroads so desperately relied on just to stay afloat. Adding literal fuel to this global fire was a major shift in monetary policy. Both Germany and the United States passed acts, like the U.S. Coinage Act of 1873, that essentially demonetized their currency, stopping the minting of silver coins to move toward a strict gold standard. By dropping silver, the U.S. drastically, and I mean drastically, reduced its domestic money supply. This instantly raised interest rates. Suddenly, farmers, businesses, and railroad magnates, who normally carried heavy debt loads, found money incredibly scarce and expensive right when they needed it most. Which brings us to the absolute titan of American finance, J. Cook and Company. They were a cornerstone of the country's banking establishment, heavily bankrolling the ambitious Second Transcontinental Railroad, the Northern Pacific. They had loaned over $1.5 million, money the railway was completely incapable of paying back. So what happens when the most powerful investment bank in the country suddenly finds itself holding millions in unmarketable railroad bonds? Naturally, they looked overseas for buyers, but European financial markets were completely frozen. Because of the Vienna crash and the resulting panic spreading across Germany and Central Europe, Cook simply could not sell his securities abroad. The global credit tap was firmly shut off. There was no money coming in. The suspense on Wall Street was just palpable. J. Cook was frantically trying to access a $300 million government loan to save his empire. But time simply ran out. In a shocking twist, right on the absolute verge of securing that loan, reports circulated that the firm's credit was basically worthless. On Thursday, September 18, 1873, a day that would infamously become known as Black Thursday, J. Cook and Company completely collapsed and declared bankruptcy. The unthinkable had actually happened. And financial panic erupted instantly. Just days after Cook went under, another major banking firm, Henry Clew's, failed. This set off a rapid chain reaction of bank failures that forced Wall Street into a drastic, unprecedented measure. On September 20th, 1873, the New York Stock Exchange shut its doors completely, and it stayed closed for 10 excruciating days. Imagine that today. The very heart of American finance had flatlined. What followed was absolute financial carnage. 55. That is the staggering number of American railroads that completely went belly up by November of that very same year. The speculative bubble had burst violently, taking the nation's biggest employers right down with it. To really put that into perspective, look at this. In 1872, 7,500 miles of new track were laid. By 1875, that number had plummeted to just 1,600 miles. The former backbone of the booming American economy was virtually paralyzed in just 3 years, bringing industrial expansion and construction to a grinding, brutal halt. And the collapse wasn't just confined to the rails. As the money supply completely dried up, an unbelievable 18,000 businesses went under between 1873 and 1875. Corporate profits vanished, real estate values fell off a cliff, and wages were slashed. The crisis dragged the working class into an era of immense suffering that became known as the Long Depression. The human toll was absolutely catastrophic. Unemployment skyrocketed, reaching a peak of 8.25% by 1878. Desperate people were left with absolutely no safety net. This immense frustration eventually led to violent clashes in the streets, like the 1874 incident where police violently attacked unemployed workers protesting in New York's Tompkins Square Park. The suffering eventually boiled over into open rebellion. In 1877, pushed to the absolute brink by vanishing paychecks, including a third consecutive wage cut in just a single year, rail workers in Martinsburg, West Virginia, launched massive protests. This ignited the Great Railroad Strike, a movement so widespread and so intense that local militias actually sympathized with the workers, forcing the president to urgently dispatch federal troops just to restore order. Listen to this haunting quote from one of the striking workers in Martinsburg. They said, "Might as well die by the bullet as to starve to death by inches." It's a chilling reminder of the tragic human cost born entirely from reckless financial speculation and corporate overinvestment. Real lives, real families, and entire communities were devastated by the popping of an invisible market bubble. So how did the government actually try to fix this mess? Well, they fiercely debated two paths. First, Congress tried passing the Ferry Bill in 1874 to print more currency. That would increase inflation and reduce those crushing debt burdens on ordinary people. But President Ulysses S. Grant vetoed it. Instead, they took the second path, passing the Specie Resumption Act of 1875, choosing to rigidly back American currency with gold. Now, this successfully curbed inflation and stabilized the dollar for wealthy investors, but it kept money incredibly tight and painful for everyday citizens. The ripple effects of this depression were so massive, they even changed the political course of American history. Ambitious Southern Railroad programs completely crashed, leaving state governments buried in debt. While wealthy Northern speculators often swooped in and bought up these failed assets for pennies on the dollar, ordinary citizens in Southern states became the massive losers of the panic. To survive, state governments slashed spending and retreated into fiscal ruin. This completely reshaped the political landscape, returned control of the South to the Democrats, and ultimately brought the era of Reconstruction to an abrupt close. The Panic of 1873 reshaped the entire globe. It proved that unchecked speculation, overinvestment in a single booming industry, and tight monetary policies can collapse an entire financial system in a matter of days. Which leaves us with a pretty critical question to ponder. Are today's financial markets still vulnerable to that exact same dangerous mix? As we look at the legacy of 1873, we really have to ask if modern economies have actually learned the lessons of the past, or if we're just blindly building the next transcontinental bubble. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and always keep asking the big questions.